think I'm interested in, in studying the history of women in science and medicine because I find the group of women who went into science and medicine very interesting, fascinating people, and especially historically because they overcame so much that was working against them in their lives in the social realm at the same time as they were able to make real contributions scientifically and in the laboratory or in the clinic. And I just think that's a terrific combination for any individual woman to accomplish, and I like to study it.
It's essential for women to be doing the research on women's health issues because for too long our health and our bodies have been defined by men, and it's time for women to take control and make the definitions of our own health and illness ourselves.
I started out as a physician and I practiced medicine, and I think there was a point at which I wanted to know more about a smaller area of life, and I chose what I do, that is neuroanatomy, because I enjoy looking through microscopes. I like to look at structure, and I like to find some organization that has functional meaning.
Science is affecting everyone's life. Science is particularly affecting the lives of women, and yet women aren't being involved in the decisions being made. It's time now for women to get together, make an impact on science, so that the priorities in science, the values in science, can make science more appropriate to every woman's needs.
The relationship of women and science is extremely complex. Women have a long history as scientists and physicians, but it's a history filled with great struggle. Feminists in science and related fields are now exploring this history. They're also exploring the relationship of women to scientific institutions such as medicine, healthcare, and education. Feminists in science are also challenging some fundamental scientific premises. They are challenging science not to negate or destroy it, but to enrich it. Women who work in the sciences share many concerns with all women who work outside the home. Problems with childcare, difficulties coordinating personal and professional lives, unequal wages and limited employment opportunities are issues that come immediately to mind. Although these issues are crucial in the relationship of women in science, we will not examine them in this program. We will focus on issues unique to science. We'll look at some effects of the women's movement and feminism on science, healthcare, and history. We're going to hear from several women scientists and scholars about the feminist critique of science, the relationship of the medical and health institutions to women's lives, and the past and present history of women in science and medicine. We will also learn how to conduct further investigations on these topics from a librarian who specializes in women's studies research. Let's begin with the feminist critique of science. Throughout the centuries, science has established itself as a method of objective, value-free inquiry. On the surface, it appears synonymous with truth. The scientific method claims to test ideas about the universe by carefully controlled measurement of data. Because one scientist can repeat the experiment of another scientist with the same results, the findings are often considered factual, objective, and true. Yet feminist scientists are showing that science, far from being factual, unbiased, and value-free, has produced a long history of culturally biased myths about women and blacks. Work in certain branches of science, namely sex difference research and sociobiology, has actually claimed that women and blacks are physically and intellectually inferior due to hormones, genetic coding, and evolution. Dr. Ruth Bleier is a neurobiologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her book, Science and Gender, offers an investigation of sex difference research and sociobiology and a scathing critique of scientific objectivity. We asked Dr. Bleier why scientific objectivity is a crucial concept to critique and why it is important to her book, Science and Gender.
Well, scientists have enjoyed a mystique of objectivity, and science itself has probably all the time. And of course, scientists like themselves to believe that they are objective in all of their investigations. And I think that people tend to forget that scientists are, like other human beings, born into a particular culture. They're born into a particular class, race, gender, ethnicity, religion, nationality, all of the factors that go toward molding a worldview that each of us has. It molds our experiences in our lives and our attitudes, our beliefs, and really what it is we need and want to believe, and it affects our work. And for scientists in particular, what it means is that it will affect the kinds of questions that we find interesting to investigate, the language that we use, the way we interpret our data, and even what we see.
In your book, you express concern about the role of science in creating the myth of women's biological inferiority. Can you summarize one key argument that you have with sex difference research?
Yes, let me show you this at the blackboard. The sex differences that are of interest to people these days are cognitive sex differences. That is, differences, say, in verbal ability or mathematical or visuospatial abilities. And those are the kinds of studies that get into the press. But if we take any population of girls and boys or women and men, let's say from a particular school or class, and we'll chart their scores, say, on visuospatial or mathematical ability. So let's say a low score is 50 and a high is 150 and the middle is 100. And we chart all of the girls' scores. You'll get a graph that looks something like that. And then if we look at the boys, we'll get another graph that will look something like that. In other words, they're almost completely superimposable. There might be, in certain populations of girls and boys, a slight difference, say, in the mean scores between the two populations. But this is not a true sex difference. You can't predict from this what if you know the sex of a person and you know that she's a girl, you cannot predict what her score will be, nor that of a boy. Or if you take a particular score, you don't know whether that's a girl or a boy there. And what it means more importantly is right at the top, you will have a few girls that are better than all the rest of the boys, just as you will have a few boys that are better than all the rest of the girls. So that when you have what is in effect a very trivial, if existent at all, between certain populations, but if you have a very trivial difference in the mean scores between two populations in the face of the enormous difference there is in the training and the early experiences and in the expectations for girls and boys, then it doesn't make sense to be looking for biological explanations, which is the popular trend in science today.
Well, then is it possible to separate nature from nurture, biology from learning?
Well, I don't think so. I think that from scientifically speaking, it's a meaningless question, the separation of nature from nurture and biology from learning, because in the first place, from the time of conception, genes, for example, are in constant interaction with their environment. Genes interact with each other. They interact with all of the other elements within the fetus, and the fetus is in turn in constant interaction with the maternal environment, which is in turn in constant interaction with the external environment. And we know that this is true because of the effect of, say, viruses in the early trimester, or of certain drugs like thalidomide or excessive alcohol or other kinds of drug use that can affect genes' actions so that you get developmental disabilities. And this is particularly true for the brain. Particularly the brain of the human being, and this is, after all, the brain is the organ of behavior. The brain of a human being doubles in size by the end of the first year of life, and it doubles again by the end of the fourth year. That is, our brain quadruples in size. And that increase in brain size is secondary to increase in the complexity and the size of nerve cells, that is, of our neurons in the brain. Nerve cells ordinarily have a cell body, and then they have very extensive dendritic tree that connects and makes connections with all of the other nerve cells in the body. There's something like 50 billion of them. Each one of these makes 1,000 or more connections with other nerve cells. But this kind of growth of the nerve cells is what takes place within the first 4 years of life, and it takes place in interaction with this tremendous input of sensory information. It's been shown, for example, in kittens and monkeys, that if you deprive them of visual information, that part of the brain that processes vision, those neurons don't grow like this. They're going to be very simple and don't make their normal structure and connections, which means then that biology itself, in a very basic sense, in the sense of the structure and the function of our nerve cells of our brain, is dependent upon sensory input.
Sociobiology is another scientific field that is of major concern to you. Would you discuss the basic problem that you have with sociobiology, why you challenge it so thoroughly, why you consider it a bad science?
Well, I think that it is. Sociobiology is sociobiology with the small s is a perfectly legitimate study of the social behavior of animals, but the sociobiology that was introduced in 1975 by E.O. Wilson attempts to explain all of human behaviors on the basis of our genes. That is, that behaviors and our forms of social organization have been programmed into our genes because they have been evolutionarily important. What they say is it's a circular argument that if we have certain behaviors and forms of social organization, that it's because we have to, otherwise we wouldn't have, that's evolutionarily necessary, otherwise we wouldn't have survived. So what's wrong in the first place is that they set up then universals, that all forms of social organization are characterized by male-dominated hierarchies, that all males are aggressive, that all females are passive and nurturant and coy. And since you can't find fossil evidence for any of those things, they look to other animals, and then they select only particular examples of animals and ignore the examples that would not confirm their hypotheses. And in addition, they use anthropomorphic language. That is, they use particular words like rape that have meaning only for human beings, and they say that they find rape among flowers and among ducks and say, aha, this shows then the naturalness of this behavior.
Dr. Bleier addresses some of the major issues involved in the feminist critique of science. Other scientists are grappling with the relationship of scientific institutions and women's lives. Dr. Mariamne Whatley is a biologist who has studied the relationship of women and health care. She regularly teaches a course on women's health and biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Whatley explained how feminism and the women's movement have affected the health care system.
The women's movement has had a major impact on the healthcare system. If you look at the basic issue underlying the women's health movement's approach to the healthcare system, it's the issue of control. That is, how much control a woman has over her own body. And what has happened is that more and more control has been taken back by women. One way to look at it is the issue of self-knowledge and education. When Our Bodies, Ourselves was published, it had a major impact on women because it was finally demystification of medical technology and medical language. Finally, women were able to find out a lot about our own bodies, and that generated a whole number of courses, books, seminars, consciousness-raising groups that were focused on body issues, on the self-help movement. Suddenly women were buying their own speculums, doing self-examination, and realizing that what was going on in the doctor's office was not something beyond our comprehension. The next step was then to redefine ourselves, not just as passive recipients of expertise from the doctor, but as actual active experts on our own bodies. And to then take that information to the doctor. We are the experts on our bodies. You have the medical expertise. If we work together, then I'm going to get the best health care I can. And what happened was that suddenly there were a lot of assertive women in the doctor's office. There were women who came in with lists of questions. There were women who said, when you do a pelvic exam, I want a mirror so I can see what's going on. Who are saying, what does this prescription mean? Tell me exactly what the side effects and risks are. And that assertiveness was very disconcerting, but then physicians began responding. For one thing, basic issue of consumer pressure. That is, if there was a physician who was very responsive to women who wanted this kind of respectful treatment, then more women would end up going to that physician. And basically there's a network, and people begin to find out who's the doctor to go to. And then it moved beyond this personal level. The personal assertiveness was very important. But then women began organizing around health issues, and there began to be more changes, for example, in the childbirth area, that women were demanding different kinds of settings for childbirth, that is, more personalized setting, demanding less medicalization. And hospitals that didn't respond to those demands were losing customers. So it's very basic consumer issues. And in addition, there's been a lot of organizing on a political level, lobbying, and so on. So what's happened is that there has been this impact that's ongoing, and the movement is continuing to grow.
Along with challenging and seeking to reform science and institutions such as medicine and healthcare, feminists in science and related fields are exploring the history of women in science and medicine. Dr. Judith Leavitt is a historian and chairperson of the Department of the History of Medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her recent book, Women and Health in America, documents the history of women in healthcare both as patients and practitioners since colonial times. Dr. Leavitt, the history of women in medicine and science is a history of prejudice and struggle, but women have found ways of overcoming the discrimination against them. Can you tell us something about the history of women in the medical profession and the difficulties they've had to deal with?
Yeah, let me start out by saying that women have always practiced medicine. Informally, they have been as mothers and aunts and cousins and sisters, the caretakers of families. They've delivered babies for millennia. But it is only in this country, in the middle of the 19th century, when women gained formal acceptance into regular medical colleges in this country. And as you probably are aware, Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to gain entrance into a male medical school, the Geneva Medical College in New York, in 1847. She graduated in 1849, the first woman to receive a regular medical degree in this country. But she was alone in her time. She was followed very quickly by many women. And by the end of the 19th century, by 1900, there were approximately 7,000 women practicing medicine in this country. And the question really for us is to figure out how they did it relatively rapidly in the 19th century after Elizabeth Blackwell paved the way. And the easiest answer to that question is that they formed their own medical schools, that women's medical colleges. There were 17 women's medical colleges in this country in the 19th century, and they formed the bulk of women who were trained in medicine. But women also gained entrance, after a struggle, to other medical colleges other than Geneva Medical School. The University of Michigan, for example, trained enormous numbers of women in the 19th century and was really a good place for women to gain a medical education. And at the end of the century, Johns Hopkins, the foremost medical college in the country, admitted women when it opened its doors. The first day it opened its doors, a quarter of its class was female. So women did gain entrance after a struggle and after continuing the struggle. One of the things that's interesting for historians to look at is what happened to that trend. And what we see in the early part of the 20th century is that there was a rapid decline in the number of women entering medical schools and then ultimately practicing medicine. In part, the decline can be explained by the fact that many of the women's medical colleges closed as a response to women being accepted into the male medical mainstream. Women wanted a regular medical education. If they could get it in male schools, they were very happy, or at least they thought they would be, and so that the women's medical colleges closed. But then women rapidly found that in male schools it was harder for them in many respects, especially if they were admitted only in low numbers, and that was frequently the case. The Chattanooga Medical College, for example, admitted in its 1902 class one woman, and the photographs of this one woman being alone in this class full of male students was obviously a very difficult experience for her and a very alienating one. And so part of the decline of women in medicine is explained by that fact. There were other things that affected women's numbers in medicine in the 20th century, and that was sometimes very overt discrimination against them, a very a common sentiment that women were not to be welcomed into medicine. One of the encouraging things for the historian to notice is that although in the beginning of the 20th century there were the numbers of women in medicine decreased, they have been increasing again, in part as a result of the federal guidelines in the late 1960s. And the numbers of women in medical schools and practicing medicine in this country are again approaching their 19th century levels, which were quite high. In 1900, for example, in Boston, about 20% of the practitioners were female, and we are again approaching those numbers, and I'm very pleased to see the trend in our present day.
Having looked at the history of women in medicine and the prospects for women in medicine today, we are left with the question of how things look for women in other scientific professions. Dr. Nancy Worcester is a scientist who met with a group of women scientists in London to deal with the issue of women leaving the scientific profession. We asked Dr. Worcester to summarize some of the conclusions her group came to concerning women and science.
The group of women scientists in London that got together tried to look at issues both about the role of women in science and how science affects the lives of all women. We looked at what was happening in science, and we found that there are lots and lots of women working in science. But like in so many fields, the women are concentrated in low-paid, low-status jobs. And what this means is the decisions in science, the values in science, very much reflect the men that are making those decisions and influencing those values. We looked a lot about how different science could be if women were playing a more important role in science, how it would affect women's lives. We certainly think if some of the values of the women's movement could be integrated into science, we'd have a very different science. Science doesn't have to be competitive, hierarchical, individualistic. We've seen examples perhaps in the Cultural Revolution in China where a very different kind of science was being worked out, where whole teams of people working together, not as individuals, but as teams with a community. Papers were written as groups, decisions were made as groups, and the dirty work was done by everyone. We think if women were more involved in science, it could look a little bit more like that, or who knows what it could look like. Science right now, of course, is affecting every woman's life, although most women aren't involved in it. We think if women were more involved in it, in the decisions, the priorities, maybe science would affect women's lives and men's lives in a different way. For example, if women had been involved in some of the research around contraceptive development the last 30 years, I suspect the contraceptives available to women now might look a bit different. If war technology weren't left in the hands of men, I suspect it wouldn't just be an extension of little boys' toys. And I think maybe if scientists really wanted to change the role of women in society, the kind of domestic technology we have available might look different. We also looked at the contradictions between what it's like to be a woman in our society and what it takes to be a good scientist. There seem to be real contradictions, particularly if a woman wants to be a mother. It's very, very hard in science to choose to take a year or two off to enjoy motherhood. In reality, if you've taken 1 or 2 years off from science, it's a conscious decision not to play an important role in science. We feel that if a lot more women could be involved in science, that it would make it easier for even more women to be involved. Once women are involved in making the decisions, then we think how science affects women's lives could make it much more appropriate to all women's needs.
Obviously, women still form a small minority in the scientific community, and times change rather slowly. However, students of women's studies are fortunate that more and more women are studying the relationship of women in science, are challenging science and its institutions, and are affecting change. Students can also draw on a growing body of published materials to get more information on the issues of women in science. Ms. Susan Searing is a librarian who specializes in women's studies resources for the statewide University of Wisconsin system. We talked with her about how to get more information on the issues raised by feminist scientists and scholars.
You can learn a lot by talking to scholars and scientists, but a systematic, in-depth search for information requires that you use the full resources of your library, that you delve into the small but growing body of literature about women in science. You can start your search at the library's catalog. You can use the catalog, whether it's a traditional card catalog or a newer computerized catalog, both to locate new books and to track down historical sources. To find books on the subjects covered earlier, look in the catalog under such headings as Women Scientists, Women in Science, Women Engineers, Women Physiology, and Science Social Aspects. Biographies of individual women scientists are entered in the catalog under their names. In addition to the catalog, there are a handful of specialized bibliographies you can use to identify relevant works. Some are published commercially. For example, Women in Medicine, while others, such as Women in Science and Mathematics, are issued by women's studies programs, professional organizations, and government agencies. As in other branches of feminist scholarship, path-breaking bibliographies on women in science may be buried in anthologies, textbooks, dissertations, or journals. For example, the book, Biological Woman, The Convenient Myth, contains a lengthy bibliography treating many topics surrounding women's relation to science. If you need an introduction to the field with a critical overview of recent publications, then a review article will serve you well. Signs, the leading academic journal in women's studies, often features review essays by experts in the different disciplines. A ready-made bibliography or bibliographic essay can be a terrific shortcut in the research process. Ask a reference librarian to help you scout out bibliographies on your particular interests.
We know that there are more books being written about women in science than ever before, but it's still a very new field. We asked Susan Searing what a researcher does if a particular research topic isn't covered in a book yet and there are no bibliographies about it.
Because so little has yet been published about women in science in book form, you'll need to search for other types of publications: periodical articles, government documents, research reports, and the like. Interdisciplinary indexes in women's studies and the various reference sources in the branches of the sciences are both important. Women's studies abstracts is the key to journal articles about women published since 1972. Studies on Women abstracts is a much newer service. Both index articles in feminist journals and in scholarly journals in the social sciences and humanities. A sound research strategy combines a reliance on women-focused sources with a systematic use of sources in the sciences. Turn to indexes in the sciences for references on such topics as occupational hazards, diseases affecting women, and contraceptive technology. General Science Index and Applied Science and Technology Index are both good pointers to profiles of women working in scientific and technical professions. Biological and Agricultural Index, Index Medicus, and Biological Abstracts are all specialized indexes that are especially useful for researching questions about female physiology. And don't forget about the standard indexes in the social sciences, in business, history, and education, and that old standby, Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. They can all be extremely helpful in unearthing information and opinions about women's employment and training in the sciences. Many indexes are now accessible by computer. A librarian can conduct a quick and efficient online search for you.
As anyone who has done library research knows, a researcher can gather all the pertinent reference material, complete all the reading, and find that she still needs specific pieces of information to support or strengthen her research. We asked Susan Searing what one does in that particular situation.
Sometimes you simply need facts, biographical background, or statistics, for example. Notable American women and American men and women of science both document the lives of women scientists. Statistics can provide powerful evidence of women's unequal participation in science, both in the workforce and in schools and colleges. For facts and figures, turn to sources like American Statistics Index and special studies from research institutes and the federal government. The University of Wisconsin offers many opportunities for finding out about women in science. Make the most of general library holdings on your own campus and rely on specialized collections in Madison for additional materials.
The Office of the Women's Studies Librarian at Large is another unique resource. The office provides a variety of research services to students, teachers, librarians, and administrators throughout the system. The publications of the Librarian at Large are mailed free of charge to interested Wisconsin residents. For subscription information, write to Women's Studies Librarian at Large, 112A Memorial Library, 728 State Street, Madison, Wisconsin, 53706. We have explored many issues involving the complex relationship of women in science. Many questions have been raised. With the help of the library, we can pursue these issues and questions in greater depth, and we can begin to produce our own research and writing on the relationship of women and science.